go through it, and I'd love to talk about eruption theory and the thing you were saying the other day about the information that's not lost and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Right, right.
Love
Yeah.
and we can also, if we have time, we can also talk about this issue of how far down it goes and all that.
Yeah, ideally we want to have a measure, right? Like a operationalized criterion for that. So this is exactly what this is about. Let me
Yep.
just see what's the best way of sharing this. So I think um is it okay if I put up my second screen? I will be a little absent looking to the side. Maybe if you're
Yeah,
gonna
yeah.
record this, it'd be better like if I have it in the background.
Well, it's mostly going to be I mean, just share the screen. Like, I don't even know that we're going to see you. We're just going to see the slide, so it's fine. Just share
Oh,
the
okay. Okay, all right. Yeah, because
share the
so
slide.
that I can see you basically, it's easier that way.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. All right. Safari, entering, share. How's that looking?
Perfect. Yeah, I can see it. Great.
Okay, let's put this over here.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so this is the new paper that just recently came out, and it's a more mature version of eruption theory that now both considers not just the mental causation or like the agency part, but also the other direction, like how does something non-mental become part of the mental, part of subjective experience, part of mental content. And so now it has these both classic problems, which come in many varieties. But I think now in this paper, for the first time, I see a way in which we can do science with them, which is getting me very excited. So I'm gonna take us through like the main figures because they kind of encapsulate the different stages of the argument. So we start here. Okay, so the human version of the mind-body problem. So, we're asking here the big questions. How is the mind related to matter and vice versa? Analytic philosophers have been banging their head against this problem for a long time. And if you read Kim's kind of like final book account of this, I quite enjoyed it for its clarity of showing that even if we solve the problem of mental causation by going kind of a reductionist route and just basically saying that, the mental is the physical and therefore the physical can cause the physical, you lose a lot of what is nice about thinking about the mind in terms of its qualities and teleology and your intentions and free will. Everything goes out the window, but you might save causality, right? So you still might get mental causation saved that way. But the problem is that if some of our things that we do depend on conscious experience, then the problem is not fully solved. Because that would mean that you also have to have an account to solve the hard problem of consciousness to have a full account of mental causation. And so right from the start, I want to be realist about this in the sense that, I do think that our experiences make a difference for how we behave, right? And if someone wants to say that our experiences don't make a difference to how we behave, we've kind of like have two different premises, like the conversation already kind of stops there. But to my mind, it's a very hard sell to try to argue that our experiences don't make a difference. You basically lose most of the population of this planet, basically just, exits the conversation, right? So we should do our best not to go down that route. But what that means is that we also have to solve the problem of consciousness. So these are interlocked, right? And this is a big problem. It gets worse because you might think, well, that's just for people, because that's the problem of consciousness. What if you talk about rats or even more basal cognition, then this might not be an issue. But what I propose is that actually there's a more general mind-body problem lurking in the background. So on the left-hand side, I call this the hard problem of efficacy, which is that for any mental property, let's say a representation, a goal state, or whatever you have, there's a problem explaining how that state as such, as being a mental state, makes a difference to the physical state. So it's a generalization of the problem of mental causation. So it's not good enough to say there's a supervenience relationship or something like that, but the causality at the bottom level maintains. What I want to say is, how do we say that the goal, as being a goal, as being an intention, as having normativity conditions, as being able to succeed or to fail, or to be better or worse, and things like that, the whole normativity of it, that also somehow needs to be able to account it for in this kind of account, right? And that's a hard problem of efficacy. And then we have the hard problem of content, which is how does anything even become part of the mind in the first place? And so representationalism, for example, just kind of brushes this away a little bit. But let's say even if we gave representationists half of this and said, okay, let's not worry about how to naturalize content in terms of its origins. Let's say some future point, we have a story of how you go from something purely physical to something that has semantic content, that has mental content, that has aboutness conditions or normativity. Let's assume that problem is solved. Then we still have the problem of how does that even make a difference to something physical? You know, take a thing like I don't know, like a neuron in the brain that's supposed to represent, I don't know, your place in a maze or something like that, your classic, you know, place cell stuff. Well, the fact that it's representational, that it has representational content, which is kind of like Nobel Prize winning material, right? So this is, you know, exciting stuff. We find the correlation, but then where in our analysis of the neural activity itself does the content enter the picture? All right, so when we look into the brain and say, here's this neuron, and we know it's correlated with this, you know, content outside of the rat, like being its position in the maze. But hey, you know, like the rest of what we're seeing here is just physics. It's just biochemistry. It's electrical potentials, right? It's like, you know, membranes opening and closing and molecules floating around. There's no content there. There's no normativity. It's just physics, right? So there's a kind of sense of disconnect here where how do we even work across this gap? And my feeling is that this is not, we can't just, you know, talk it away. My feeling is that we should face it head on and say, yes, there is a big gap here, right? On the one hand, we can talk about content and consciousness and the mental and intentions and norms, health, you know, being, you know, worse or better and so on. Terms that have no frame of reference in the purely physical sciences, but they do have an existence and we know they make a difference. So we're realists about it. So why don't they show up when we do our best science, you know? And one of the things that, you know, already should come out of this is that just because they don't show up as such doesn't mean that they don't make any difference. Okay, so that there are two different things here. One would be a demand for observability and even maybe intelligibility. So I observe something and it makes sense as a content. And the other one is to say, well, maybe that's not what I can do here, but I notice that something else is happening that wouldn't happen otherwise, you know, if the system wouldn't be in such a state and so on. So, you know, so far, most people have demanded that the mechanism should be observable and intelligible. But why should we assume that, right? There's a big gap here. And we know already from other fields, quantum physics, a prime example, that demanding intelligibility and observability can be a big stumbling block, right? Sometimes you just have to give in and say, yeah, you know, we don't understand why it's happening, but something's happening and we can measure that and we can work with that, you know? But so far, cognitive science hasn't done this, you know, allowed itself to conceive this possibility. So let's go down. So what I want to propose is that we do need to make this room for this conception. That's why I call it a black box framework. Let's just for a moment accept that we don't understand this relationship. So we have two versions of that. Let's stick with the human one for a moment because it's easier for us to relate to. So we have mental causation. The scenario is, you know, putting our neuroscience hats on or whatever, you know, looking inside an organism, okay? If something mental makes a difference to its material basis of this behavior, you've got an unobservable mental cause, right? Like I just said, we just have physical stuff happening. We don't see the mind as such when we go inside the organism, causing an unintelligible material event. And it's unintelligible because we cannot directly observe what caused it, what made the difference. Okay, that's outside of the scope of our observation when we make quantitative assessments. And the other way around is the same. So, you know, we know that some things happening in the brain make a difference to mental content or make a difference to subjective experience, but we can't measure subjective experience directly inside the brain. It's not there. It's not something that we can actually quantify directly. So that would mean that to the extent that something is making a difference to experience, you've got a cause without an observable effect. Okay, so you've got an unintelligible material effect event here that something is happening, some change is happening, but we don't understand why it's happening. Okay, so we've got these two categories, and what's interesting is that they point in different ways. So that already suggests that, you know, the signatures for these kinds of relationships would be different ones. And so this is then where I introduce my proposal for how to work with this kind of situation. And this is the eruption theory, where if we have the mind and the matter relating to each other and we don't know how, okay, this is the hard problem of efficacy or mental causation or the hard problem of consciousness. We know that they're related somehow, but when we trace one domain into the other, it escapes us. Okay, so let's just go through this one more time, right? I have an intention of saying words, of moving my hand to make a point, and I can notice that my intention is making a difference to my body, right? If not, it would be crazy, right? So, I have the experience that there's a coherence between what I want to do and what my body does, except that I don't know how my body does it. Okay, something gets lost along the way. I can see the effect of my intention, but I don't have access to how it has that effect. So that's one aspect of the black box, right? And it's also true on the other side. So now imagine I'm a neuroscientist and I look at what's happening in the pathway from my brain to my arm to make my arm move. If it's really the intention as such that's making my arm move, well, the neuroscientist doesn't have access to that. He can't measure intentions using his, I don't know, EEG apparatus or whatever he might be using. So again, something gets lost. I can go work backwards from the behavior to all the activity in my body, but at the end, something gets lost. I cannot actually make the jump to the other side. So that's what I mean with the black box. We know these things are related, but by some reason, maybe by necessity, we can't trace properly, translate like transparently across. And so that's why I propose the way to think about this is in terms of absorption and eruption. Absorption means that on the side of the mental, when I inject my intention to do something, it basically there's a compression effect. Dreyfus talked about this in terms of absorbed coping, right? So when I'm really engrossed in my activity, actually, there's a narrowing of my vision. The world disappears a little bit into the background. I lose myself and so on. There's a kind of like compression of the variability of my experience as it's invested into the activity of my behavior. But what happens on the other side? Okay, now you're totally involved in generating your behavior, but that involvement is subjective involvement. It can't be, quantified. It can't be translated into something happening purely in quantitative terms. So then that means that there's a hidden variable. Okay, now there are factors making a difference to how your behavior is generated that cannot be, traced to causes at that level of description. That's what I call eruption. Now there's a kind of diversification, an increase in variability that in principle would remain unexplained at that level of description. We can't trace it back to the higher level. And that was the original proposal of eruption theory in the first paper. And I elaborated on that part a lot. And there's many examples that we can talk about of, how this fits with some of the empirical data. And when we talk about neural entropy and complexity and all these kind of things, and why organisms are such noisy systems in the first place, a lot of this starts to make sense from this point of view. But then let's talk about the other side first for a moment. That's the absorption side. That's the new part of this paper, which is to say that if there's a cause that has an effect which can't be observed, it's a little bit like a reduction in variability. Now, difference that would have been made is now not being made because that difference is appearing in a domain that I cannot directly measure in the one that I'm currently observing. So there's a reduction in variability. So two things kind of collapsing or canceling each other out. There's information loss of a different kind as things are getting kind of translated into the other domain. And so right now, what I'm working on is more on the right-hand side, trying to flesh out that part. And it's coming together quite nicely with the things we've been talking about, like bow tie motifs and things like that, which are very nice ways of canceling out things. I think that's pretty much it. So let me just end on one final note, which is that in my mind, this is just a first step of something much more general. And so what it looks like to me now is that this is just one special case of an interaction that crosses two ontological domains or regional domains of being. Or if you want, it could also be considered as crossing different scales of agency, right? Going from the scale of agency of inside your body and all the agents that are working there to your agency as a person. But basically, as long as we have a transition between ontologies of some kind, then this kind of framework probably will apply too. And that could even be true for cellular biology, for example. So when I was reading your work on how is it that the higher levels, transform the lower levels and how do they get incorporated into the higher levels again, you have very similar notions actually as eruption and absorption already. So with eruption, the way you phrase it is that there's a deformation of the energy landscape of the lower level. right? So suddenly, these guys are happily doing whatever they're doing, but now there's an unexpected change in the game that they're playing, and they would have to slightly adjust. And from their point of view, well, they will never be able to figure out why that happened. What just happened? That's outside of their scope, right? So it's a little bit like an eruption in that sense. There's an increase in a change, unexpected, and it can't be explained at that level of description. Okay, it just goes beyond it. And at the same time, when you talk about how the components get integrated into the larger whole, you talk about something like a loss of identity or something like that, right? So for example, the molecules produced by one cell, well, they're not tagged with the name, right? So if another cell produces it, they can't distinguish where it's coming from. So they kind of like, the identity starts to merge between the different little components. So that's very close to what I'm talking here in terms of absorption. And so one thing that would be very nice to contemplate is whether this kind of framework gets a quantitative grip on some of the things that are happening at those scales. So not just talking about the mind-body problem or mental causation, but just talking about multiscalar integration to some extent. So principles that would apply to the left-hand side, the eruption side, would be, increases in noise, increases in hidden variables, dimensionality, entropy, these kinds of things. So there's obviously an expansion of variability, and that expansion is unexpected and to some extent irreducible to the things that are happening normally in that domain. And on the right-hand side, you have things like compression, maybe synchrony, symmetries, order parameters, this kind of thing, where there's a kind of information loss as multi-components that could be behaving differently normally don't behave differently. And that's maybe the bow tie motive and things like that fit into that category. So anyway, that's kind of like the mini overview of what the paper proposes.
Cool. Yeah, very, very interesting. What's your thought on do you think there is a similar problem in the case of, so let's say we have some sort of classic computational device, it's running some sort of algorithm, and then there's the physics perspective where you can see the electrons shuffling around. You don't actually see the algorithm, whatever it's doing. Do you think there's a similar dynamic going on there, or is there something unique to the biological case that isn't captured in the software hardware dichotomy, if there is?
I think it's a really good question. It's one that I started exploring now with some colleagues at UNAM. And I think I'm changing my mind about it. So I used to be very resistant to that idea, but I'm slowly coming around to it, especially on the side of absorption. It's almost like computers are the perfect absorption devices. All that variability that you have at the level of electrons and so on, computers are designed such that variability does not matter for the kind of algorithms that are being implemented, right? So if anything, like that is, the most excellent example of the right-hand side. But here's the problem. It's like one-sided, right? It's like, I don't want to put it this way, but it's like we created devices that are super rich in experience, possibly, right? So they've got lots of, variability that they're absorbing and possibly creating experiences for them, but they can't do anything about it. It's the eruption side that's blocked. Because if you do have things that are acting on those things, well, that's like, the old school Windows blue screen of death kind of stuff. Like suddenly you've got an unexplained change that can't be reduced to the rules at that level. Well, you've got error correction, right? So either it gets thrown out, or if it can't be thrown out, well, then you just got a system failure. So it seems to me that, the issues on that side. It's like, if you wanted to make computers that could fit into this framework, the question would be, how do we loosen them such that the higher levels can make a difference to the lower levels in their own terms?
Yeah. So we have a weird example that might be relevant to this, and that's maybe so I'm very interested in higher order behavior that seems to be in some important sense decoupled from the either the algorithm or the mechanisms underneath, in that it is not just emergent complexity, because emergent complexity is easy, you get that with cellular automata, whatever, that's easy. I'm talking about more interesting emergent goal directed behaviors. You've seen this preprint of ours on the sorting algorithms. I purposely wanted to start with the dumbest, simplest system that is transparent, deterministic. It's 6 lines of code. Everybody thinks they know what these things do, and these sorting algorithms. And it turns out that they have some really interesting behaviors, including this clustering thing, which is by itself nowhere in the algorithm. And so I wonder now clearly super primitive, but that was kind of the point. We wanted a very basal example of this. But I wonder if it's related to what you just said, where they on the one hand, yes, in our current architectures, they can't do anything with it. On the other hand, there seems to me, and I think this is all over the place in biology too, there seems to me that even though constrained by a deterministic algorithm that there's no magic, it doesn't screw up, it follows the algorithm correctly. There's no error in that sense, but it also manages to do some things that are not, so to speak, in the algorithm. And I wonder if, and I think biological things are super good at it. In fact, I think that's probably what we call biology, are systems that are really good at this. But fundamentally, I feel like it starts very, very early. I don't think you need much to start seeing these things appear. And where do they come from is a whole other thing. We face that question with our various synthetic xenobots and anthrobots and things, where they've never existed before. There's no evolutionary long history of selection that would explain why they do so, why they have certain properties. So where it comes from, and I mean, I'm pretty sympathetic to this kind of black box approach, because I think looking for mechanism and looking for explicit representations in terms of how it works and where things come from, I think may not always be tractable. But yeah, I think already we have some of these issues in a very minimal way with even just very simple, stupid computer architectures. And then there's the whole polycomputing thing, right? So this is what Josh Bongard and I have been working on this notion that when you have a physical process, what it is that it's computing is in the eye of an observer. And multiple observers. In fact, Josh has some amazing. His student Atusa has some amazing actual data on this, showing that the same physical processes can look like very different computations depending on how you look at them. And what is it that it's really computing is up to an observer's interpretation, which I think in biology, that's what's going on, is that every subsystem is interpreting every other subsystem however it can. And then that also gets to this issue of like mental content and the subjectivity of it, which is what is it really, what are these these mental causes and so on. What is their actual content, and is there a privileged one answer to say, okay, that's the content of that that mental state, or could we do this kind of polycomputing thing and say, well, there are modules inside, and based on what you were telling me before, there may be even physically external other beings that you may be coupled with in some way that will also have an interpretation of what any given mental state is. So yeah, I think this is partially why we were talking about like how far down it goes. I think these issues are very deep and they crop up very early. I don't think we have to wait till we get brains before these deep questions come up, of interpretation and
I've heard you talk before about this, functionalism or what you call it, but isn't it the case that, was it Putnam or someone who used the argument that you can read any kind of function into physical process as a reductio ad absurdum for computationalism? In the sense that if you want to be realist about the implementation of the algorithm, then it shouldn't just be the observer who determines what kind of algorithm is being run, right? Because I don't know what this argument was, but it was basically like, if you take any bunch of molecules and you just sub-select the right kind of properties, they'll be running Windows or something like that, because there's such a mind-blowing degree of freedom that there's enough there that you just have to be selective, and then you get whatever you want. But but the question is like, does that have downstream consequences for the process, right? And so there you don't want necessarily the observer to be the one who determines what it is that's what's there, right?
So I don't know what the reductio there is. Maybe I need to look it up. But it seems so far, it seems fine. Everything you just said seems completely fine to me, because what I think happens in biology is so in computers we're used to the fact that there's somebody who wrote the algorithm, and we tend to take that interpretation as the privileged. Like I know what this is. I wrote it. That's what I'm telling you. It's a bubble
Mm-hmm.
sort, whatever it is. But
Mm-hmm.
in biology, you don't get that, and so every subsystem with cells, subcellular components, tissues are looking at all the stuff going on around it, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't get a manual to say, well, what the hell does this mean? There's signals coming. What computation is this? And I think
Mm-hmm.
what they have to do for adaptive advantage is interpret it however they can. So they form their
Mm-hmm.
own internal model of what the computation is, and they say, oh, I see what this is. This is telling me, that the metabolism is going to shoot up 5 minutes from now. And somebody else, some other module is looking at that. No. What I see here is that this set of genes is going to be expressed, and therefore I'm going to do this and that. And right, and in that case, and Josh's work, you can see there's like it's this particulate material, and depending on how you look at it, you see an AND gate or an OR gate, and there is no privileged answer to, well, which one is it really? I mean, there is no really. And I think biology has that, takes that to an
Wait,
extreme.
wait a minute, wait a minute. Let's hold on for a second. Maybe I should read this, but if I had a computer built and like, there was an ambiguity whether an AND gate was an AND gate or an OR gate, would the computer work? No, right? I mean, like you have to depend on that it does a particular translation of its inputs to its outputs. And
Uh,
if it doesn't, then well, then you have a kind of probabilistic machine or something like that, but it would be some kind of other kind of system.
Well, so let me push back on that. I think that that's true if you stick to one observer and an idea, and the idea that there is a definitive one thing that observer wants it to do, and then yes, if the observer can't, if one observer can't tell what it's doing, that's a real problem. But
Hmm.
I don't think it's a problem if you have a physical device and there are multiple observers, and one observer says, oh, this is great, this thing's generating prime numbers, and somebody else
Hmm.
looks at it and says, oh yeah, whatever, what I see is that it's I don't know, it's doing some other function. Now,
Hmm.
for us, I mean, it's statistically very unlikely that you can say, oh look, it's running Windows, and somebody else says, oh no, it's completely different, because it's hard to have a process that matches both
Hmm.
those descriptions at the same time. But I think what happens in biology, because there's noise, there's a high tolerance for fuzziness and all that, there are lots of systems that are looking at the same set of events and interpreting, building internal models of those events as completely different things. And it's like,
Okay, but I agree with that, but that's from the point of view of, looking at it, right? So if the point of view is that there are multiple interpretations possible and that diversity of points of view is helpful in some way for the systems around it, I can totally agree with that. And I think that's interesting to explore. But that's very different than saying that those multiple possible perspectives make a difference to the process itself, which is lending itself to be interpreted in these multiple ways.
well, what I think then happens is, the other side of the equation, and I think you're absolutely right in how you divide this, right, into the two sides. So the other
Mhm.
side is Tenenbaum's. Have you seen this his paper, "The Child as a Hacker"?
A child is a hacker. It sounds
Yeah,
familiar, but
it's really good, and it's this notion overall. I mean, like I sort of expand that beyond. I mean, he's studying, brains and human development and so on. The notion of hacking is, where what's fundamental there is that you don't know or care what the correct way to interact with a system is. You are going to
Mhm.
exploit it however you can. Right. That's
Mhm.
kind of this notion of it. And so I think what happens in the biology is that part of interpreting these things however you want is that you
Mhm.
are also going to use that to control them however you
Mhm.
can. So you try to
Mhm.
find ways, right? So I think that's basically what's happening in biological material, is that every both within levels and across levels, you have systems that are constantly hacking each other and
Oh
trying.
yeah, no, I completely agree. So here we're on the same page. Actually, like, you know, this is something that also follows from the framework I was proposing. Because if there's a black box,
Yeah,
basically the components at different levels have to have a high level of tolerance of uncertainty. And they have trust, they have to have trust to some extent. You know, sometimes from their point of view, it doesn't make sense what's going on around them. But that doesn't mean that they should disengage or kind of like, you know, fight it or try to resist it or counteract it. Because what it could mean is that actually it's a different level of agency, a higher level of agency, rearranging things, aligning things. And, you know, you need to just roll with it, even if you don't have everything that, you know, is required in order to understand where that's coming from. And but if because of that, there is a gap for, you know, free riders or pathogens or something like
yes,
that to take
yes.
advantage of exactly the same trusting nature that, you know, okay, today I'm producing this other molecule. I don't know why I'm producing it. Yeah, it turns out you're hijacked by a virus and it's not, you know, the higher levels that are kind of like, you know, messing with you. So, but yeah, that's kind of built into this system.
Yeah.
So you can't avoid it, you know, that's because it's such an indirect architecture. That which allows the multi-scalar integration is also that which allows, like, you know, bad things happening to some
Yeah.
extent.
Well, absolutely, and my guess is, and we're now starting to explore this experimentally, is that systems have probably biological systems probably have ways to try to determine whether something that's happening was caused by me versus
Nice. I want to
outside.
do the same for the brain. Yeah. There
Yeah,
should be probably some frame of reference in the background that tells you how much unexpectedness should you be expecting at each moment. You know,
yeah,
like what rate of unexpected events, for example.
yeah.
And if it exceeds your expected rate of unexpected events, something else is messing with you.
Yeah. That's right. Right. So it's the question of there's a couple of ways to pose it. Like, am I learning or am I being trained? That's an
Mhm,
interesting distinction, right? Because how much
mhm,
agency is there in my environment? Is there another agenda that's responsible for my learning process? And
mhm,
if you're a cell, like, so the way we're going to do it is basically to look at our readout is going to be stress response and some other things, but you know, you can
mhm,
imagine a cell or a group of cells, and you can imagine messing with it in progressively different degrees of internal targeting. So here's a
mhm,
signal that comes from the outside of the cell. Fine. Here's a
mhm,
signal that we generated, you know, in the second messenger pathway right under the membrane. Here's something that we did in the nucleus itself. Like,
awesome.
right,
Mhm,
at what point does the cell say, yeah, that's cool, that's what I'm doing, versus, you know, oh no, this is clearly coming from outside. And
yeah.
I think that
Nice. So this has quite response like a brain stimulation. So I want to get into that for our lab. And one of the reason is that if eruption theory is on the right track, you know, doing TMS to the brain or whatever stimulation is basically eruption simulation, right? So suddenly you have an uncaused
mm,
fluctuation in activity, but from the point of view of the local components in the brain, they're
mm,
used to that. That's already how they always get impacted by higher levels of organization. So then it's kind of like we're speaking the language of the higher levels of organization by injecting this, external variability. And that's nice because then we can actually play with this. Like, you know, we can say, what's the rate, you know, of agency that the system is currently expecting?
mm,
And there's all kinds of interesting things like, you know, is deep brain stimulation helpful for overcoming, I don't know, obsessive compulsive disorder or maybe like helpful in depression and so on. So certain conditions where our agency becomes constricted, somehow compressed or limited, are helped by what otherwise look like kind of crude interventions. Like, you know, why should just putting this kind of like, you know, random stimulation somewhere in your brain, you know, have the same effect as you opening up your space of agency possibilities?
mm,
That's very strange. But if the way in which agency of a personal level connects with the subpersonal level is only indirectly through this deformation of the state space in unexpected ways, basically, well, then all you have to do is deform it in unexpected ways to mimic, to some extent, the signals that they're expecting
yeah.
from the higher levels.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point. I wonder if and this is like totally beyond my expertise, but I wonder if some aspects of plastogens and psychedelics and things like this can be understood by what you're really doing is lowering the vigilance of the system to hack
Hmm.
from the higher
Nice.
levels, right?
Hmm.
So that you're more willing to sort of not resist. I mean, this issue of resistance, right? Knowing that you're being hacked,
Exactly.
right,
Hmm.
whether laterally, whether by a parasite, whether by a like a malfunctioning component, or
Hmm.
from above by some, you know, some higher level of organization. that resistance, like biomedically, this is huge because one reason I think why we have such trouble designing new drugs that actually fix anything. I mean, we have
Mhm.
almost, other than antibiotics and surgery, we have basically nothing that fixes anything, right? These drugs
Mhm.
hold down some
Mhm.
symptoms, best case scenario, but they don't really fix
Right.
anything. And I think part of it is that we are operating in a way that's very easy for the cells to tell and try to fight back.
I like it.
I
Yes.
think that's the limit, right? The limit of molecular
Yeah, yeah,
medicine.
it's like I know that someone else is messing with me. That's not coming from the higher level of
Yeah,
organization.
yeah, because it's such micromanagement, and the cell, like, what
Yeah.
the hell is this? There's this, receptor that's suddenly being targeted by some
Right,
crazy.
right.
That's why, you see all these drugs, and then there's like a list of potential side effects that are a mile long. That your head will fall off and
Yeah.
you'll go blind. All
Yeah,
this.
no, you're actually on the right track here. So I'm thinking that there could be a spectrum of possibilities. So because we're separating mind and matter a little bit, just a tiny gap between them, it opens up two possibilities. Imagine we have a reduction in agency, like dementia. Okay, so people stop being able to express themselves, language goes away, they stop being able to, take care of themselves and so on. But in that case, it could be that the brain itself is no longer, flexible enough to be able to receive these kinds of perturbations and let them percolate through the system and scale them up in the right kinds of ways. Could be that agency is almost intact to some extent. Like the mind is still there, but it just cannot find the channel to express itself. On the other hand, maybe in some other cases, like let's say depression, it could be that, the brain is fine, it's actually ready to receive whatever you're going to send it, but there's something happening at the level of motivations and will and like experience, which the person is overwhelmed or for whatever reason, it's not sending the kind of, impactful interventions that would normally make the body move in the right kind of ways. So both might from the outside look similar in the sense that there's a reduction of engagement with the world, but the physiology of it could be very different. So I like that because it feels more natural to have these two possibility axes. It's not always everything in the same place.
Yeah,
And what you're saying about the fact that we need to be a little bit more clever about how we interact with that, I really like that. So that makes a lot of sense. So, and what you're saying about, intervening in the different levels, we're starting to think about that too in terms of humans, right? So we can trigger muscles directly, by applying, contraction to your nerve fibers here. That's you can grasp like that, and that also can feel like you're actually doing it if it's doing in the good way. But what if we do it like, from here? Or what if we do it by doing something here? At which point, is there a sense for, hey, this is not me doing it
yeah,
anymore, or something
yeah.
like that?
Yeah. That's very interesting. I was actually trying to look up some papers on this, related to confabulation, and
Mm.
people with, like I've seen, examples where somebody has an electrode in their brain, and it triggers laughing, and so
Hmm.
push the button, and your mouth starts laughing. Well, the patient doesn't report. That's weird. I was having a serious thought, and then my mouth starts laughing. That's not what they
Right,
say.
right.
Oh, I had a funny, I thought of a funny joke. That's what they say.
Uh-huh.
So,
Hmm.
so this issue of confabulation, and to what extent does the system, as you said, does the system take this on as, okay, I'm going to tell a coherent story of why it was me, versus
Hmm.
no, I'm going to accept it. And actually, the dementia, and another, I just wanted to say another quick thing about dementia and those things. I have a collaborator who is a hospice nurse, and she cares for, she's not a scientist, but she's a long-term hospice nurse with a lot of experience, and we're actually writing a paper on case studies where there's this phenomenon called terminal lucidity, which is really interesting, where basically you have somebody that has been in a very debilitated state for a really long time, and it's just progressively been going down. They don't speak, all that stuff, and you think, okay, that's it, like it's all gone. And then I think, I forget the exact amount of time, but I think it's like a couple days before they actually die. It all comes back, and they have a lucid conversation with people, and they remember things, and they give some instructions and whatever. And like there's this like sudden burst, like, and it's I don't think there's a good clinical understanding of it, because if it's just the fact of the hardware degrading, then that should
That's nice. Yeah. So having a slight gap in our account would allow for that, make
exactly
sense of that possibly. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I like it. Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think, there's that clinical component. I think it would be cool to study some of that stuff from the perspective of the model that you're putting forward. I think that could help.
But here's another interesting example, clinical example, which is if we think about the absorption side, what would be the maximum version of it?
Mm.
It would be if almost the whole brain is, in synchrony. Okay, so that's like, all the local variability, each neuron has tens of thousands or connections coming in, all the variability, suddenly they're all like firing in unison, right? So it's a huge reduction of complexity, lots of information loss. When you do that, agency goes out the window, okay? You collapse. Okay, and that also makes sense because now you can't have any more eruption, right? Everything is ordered, everything is regimented. There's no possibility for injecting spurious variability anymore. It just gets, there's no room for it. Okay, so no more agency. But the model would predict that experience might still happen. In fact, it might even be more happening than in a normal state. And so I started, just a little bit investigating it. But for some people, indeed, having an epileptic fit can come with all kinds of experiences, even like divine intervention kind of experiences, right? So, like, having something that changes your life kind of experience can happen under those states. So that's interesting in the sense that it fits again with this model that, on the one hand, although it knocks out agency, now your experience channels have been opening up, on the other hand. And so it's and something that, like there's something there that there's lots of this kind of thing that you mentioned psychedelics. We didn't talk about this, but it's like the other way. Maybe it's actually loosening things up, so it becomes easier to integrate with your brain, and that fits very nicely also with other work that shows that if you're under anesthesia, if you measure neural entropy, complexity, diversity of signals. It turns out that if you're doing a cognitive task while you're slowly falling unconscious, if you're doing the task well, your neural entropy is higher than baseline. Okay, so even though you're falling unconscious, your neural entropy goes up more than expected. But if you're actually falling unconscious and you're stopped being able to do the task, then it goes down. So assuming that both groups of people actually are losing consciousness, then this kind of entropy is not tracking the state of awareness. It's tracking your cognitive effort. How involved are you mentally in what's happening? And that's going back to dementia. Like one of the best things you can do for preventing onset of dementia is learning extra languages. Engaging in extra normative frameworks. Becoming able to respond in a much more multifaceted way to your environment. And if you think about the way in which we lived before, modernization to some extent, we were embedded in a symbolic world. Everything had meaning. Nothing happens just by chance. Like the fact that this cat crossed the road might mean that my mother will die, or I don't know, something. So everything had super significance. This kind of symbolic framework was overlaying on all of our perception. And if involvement, mental involvement in our behavior is actually causing eruptions, well, then that has very loosening effects on everything. So it makes sense to me that the best way of preventing your, like things freezing up, so to speak, is to actually become more involved normatively. And it's not just about, autopilot stuff. This is important, right? So it's not, if you're just an autopilot, your body can take over. And maybe that's also a little bit about what you were saying in terms of stimulation and then, this kind of confabulation happening, right? It's kind of like the habit. The habit takes over. It's not like you're really freely willing the words coming forward. It's just that your body has a ready-made response to the situation that's kind of like, unfolding in that moment. And I think a lot of our behavior is like that. And what I've been speculating a little bit that the success of large language models to some extent hints that, even when we talk like this conversation right now, a lot of it is actually habits and our body's predispositions just unfolding themselves with the affordances in the environment. And that's why they can be modeled, by just looking at, linguistic patterns and so on. And so this is another consequence of the eruption ideas. And if you have this little gap, it also means that we're no longer directly in control of our behavior. Right? We can set the intentions. We can open the space of possibilities. We can make things more flexible, for example. But then you have to be in the right context. You have to have the right affordances. You have to have the right history of interactions. You have to have the right body for that behavior then to also express itself in the right way. And if some of these things start crumbling or deteriorating or something like that, then maybe intentions don't connect that well anymore with your behavior or with your regulation. But when things work well, it looks like we're in control because, the body just makes it happen like magic almost. But, all we can do really is to go open spaces of possibilities. But to turn those into actualities is coming out of our embodied history of interaction with the environment. So it's a different take on free will. It's interesting because, yeah, you're free in the sense that you still have the choice of opening possibility spaces, but you don't have the choice of how to close them. The only way to do that is to cultivate the right kind of environment and the right kind of skills, such that you're always poised to respond in a way that you want to be responding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I completely agree with that. I like a notion of free will that basically extends it to a longer time scale, to the idea that
Exactly.
what's free is modification of self and environment to enable you to
Exactly.
in different ways in the future. That's where you get to really exert it, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Super
Yeah,
cool.
and it's a bit strange to think about that in the first place. Like, I mean, just thinking about, like, hey, I can't directly control the next word that's coming out of my mouth. I just have to trust my body that it will choose the right word. Otherwise, I get a Freudian slip or something like that. It's yeah, but once you're okay with that, then your focus shifts and says, well, what can I do today such that tomorrow it will be better?
Exactly.
This kind of thing.
Yeah. I think that's a much more useful view of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's true of all of biology. This goes the same way. So, there's a slight indirection, which is basically the higher level of organization can't directly control what the lower level is going to do, right? Well, you can set the conditions for it. I guess I give you more possibilities to do things, or I give you less. But within that space, I just have to trust that the tendencies are the right ones.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Thanks so much. This has been very helpful. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting framework. Yeah, lots
Yeah.
to talk about.
Great. Yes, thank you. And look forward to seeing how you work with this experimentally when you start intervening at these different stages. I think that's going to be very insightful.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk more because I want to get your thoughts on some of the you basically using some of the brain clinical data to inform how we do some of the things in cells. So we'll talk.
Yeah, I think that there's a new horizon opening up with this way of thinking. Suddenly we can quantify these things and then everything changes.